The White House proposes supplemental funding in the billions to prepare for a continuing resolution. The likely CR will affect federal acquisition and contractors for fiscal 2022. Greg Giddens is partner at Potomac Ridge Consulting. He's former Chief Acquisition Officer at the Department of Veterans Affairs. Greg, welcome.
Thanks, Mimi.
So a continuing resolution just means that we're going to continue at the current funding levels. Is that necessarily a bad thing?
It's not necessarily a bad thing, but how it's appropriated and allocated can be because of the uncertainty it drives. But to a degree, we're back again to another continuing resolution. I think Congress has passed all the appropriations in 4 out of the last 40 years or so. I think the last full one was in the mid-90s when we had Cuba Gooding Jr. talking about show me the money. I wish they'd do a sequel and do show me the appropriations. The real issue is that uncertainty that pulls leadership and staff away to kind of work on the various options and methods, because it's not just funding it last year, it's funding incrementally at last year.
Well, tell me a little bit more about that uncertainty and how it affects agencies and contractors.
Sure. So if your funding last year was at $100 million, you don't get $100 million in October. You start to get in a portion of that. So maybe you get 1/12 of that or 1/10 of that, and that's then allocated through. And you're trying to then plan on when does the CR end. And really, as we've seen in the past, you only know how long a CR goes until it's over. And then you can tell how long it's been. So you have contracts in place that you're trying to fund, and you have to start breaking those off into incremental, severable segments so that you can fund those and not have a gap in service for the American public.
So how likely is a government shutdown at this point?
I think a government shutdown is unlikely, but it's going to be painful before we get there. And that pain is going to cause organizations to have to plan for it. They'll have to dust off their shutdown procedures, everything from what do you do with facility? If you're going to turn the facility off, I mean, actually turn the lights off in the facility. What do you do about people on travel? How do you recall them? How do you think about not just your staff, essential, and who's going to be furloughed? What happens with all the contracts and private industry partners and the role that they have in serving the American public? Which of those contracts can continue? They were previously funded. Which ones need to be in a facility that's now going to be closed? Maybe one thing I think COVID has taught us, we can kind of decouple location and work. So I think that'll help us some in thinking about what can we do to preserve as much of the mission that we can if we do have a shutdown.
So even though a shutdown is really unlikely, because I don't think the White House or Congress wants to go that route, we're wasting all this time preparing for it anyway?
Right, it's a fire drill that you have to do because if you're caught short and there's a shutdown and you don't have a plan, it goes from bad to worse. But you're right, in many cases you're planning and counting on something and preparing for it, hoping it doesn't happen, right? You're planning for the worst, hoping for the best.
So you were Chief Acquisition Officer at the VA until 2017. During your time there, what was your experience with a CR, the continuing resolution?
Yes, we had lots of CRs, potential shutdowns while I was at the VA. And one of the big things we tried to do was bring in all the stakeholders and understand how can we mitigate the impact on providing service to our veterans. And that made us look at things like obligations and expenditures. A lot of times acquisition leaders will just look at obligations, but sometimes you have to look at both obligations and expenditures. And you may find expenditures are lagging by many months from obligations, and that gives you some flexibility. You can de-obligate some money and then apply that to more pressing needs to cover during the CR or during the shutdown. But you got to be careful doing that. It's got to be the right appropriation. It can't be something unexpired money. You don't want to de-obligate that. You can't use it. And you also have to think about Anti-Deficiency Act violations. You don't want to be caught that a big contract action is coming up and you would be ready to award it, and it's kind of on automatic, but now with the CR you can't award it because you don't have access to your funding, because again it's an apportioned amount of 1/10 or 1/12 that you get, not at all at one time.
So what do you recommend to contractors then to start doing right now in preparation for all this?
Contractors need to be reaching out to their government counterparts and to their contracting officer representatives, to their program office leadership, to the procurement leadership, and start that dialogue about how do we best move forward given both a CR and a potential for a shutdown, and start to understand those impacts and think what can they do that represents the best in the interest of taxpayers and our citizens, but also represents the equities of the private industry companies that are partnering to deliver on mission.
Is there anything agencies can be doing to avoid that end of fiscal year crush that always comes up? I mean, we know it's coming up.
Right.
Is there something that they can do to better plan for that?
They can. They need it. It's a little bit of a strategic approach, though. And you're right. It comes every year. I mean, the calendar is July, August, September. Every year. One of the things that I've found that really strategically can work is to start to think about how to get off cycle of September. If you're looking to award a contract in September, don't make it a 3-year contract. Make it a 3.5-year contract. And let that last 6 months then move you into that springtime. You'll find things a lot more accommodating in the spring than they are in September. It's a struggle for industry and government, but I think thinking through those timing issues to move you away from that. Do a bridge contract, do an extension, 2 or 3 months early, 2 or 3 months late. Anything to move you out of that chaos would be very helpful.
That sounds like a great idea, frankly. Greg, thanks so much, and happy end of fiscal year to you.
Thank you. You too.